Should you buy vintage separates? Or any separates? Welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. Let's talk about separates. If you're unfamiliar with the term, using separates just means using separate preamp, power amp, and back in the day, tuner, rather than a receiver, which includes all of those functions, or an integrated amp, which includes preamp and power amp. If you're unfamiliar with the use of separates, you might wonder why you'd want 2 or 3 pieces of gear instead of 1. The simple answer is that separates are better. A separate preamp, also known as a control amp, typically has more features and preamplifies better than the built-in preamp in an integrated amp or receiver. A separate power amp typically produces better sound than built-in power or main amps in integrated amps and receivers. Having the preamp and power amp in different cases is also better. Am I wrong? I'm not saying that awesome integrated amps and receivers don't exist. There are plenty of awesome integrated amps and receivers. But if you're one of those people who searches and keeps searching for great sound, you're probably going to find separates eventually, as I have. But it's a recent find for me. When I was in 3rd grade, I got a clock radio. That's a radio, speakers, and clock in one small case. In the summer before 8th grade, I started listening to and recording music from the radio with a Sanyo boombox my dad had bought for the same purpose. When I was in 8th grade, I got an all-in-one stereo system, a single unit with tuner, record changer, and cassette tape player, plus external speakers. It was a big improvement over the clock radio and boombox. But I recall that after a while, the turntable was too fast. In high school, I got a nice turntable, nice but bottom-of-the-line speakers, and a bottom-of-the-line receiver. The receiver, a JVC, stopped working in the early 90s, and I left it in the basement of the tridecker I lived in. I replaced the JVC with this NAD 701. In the last few years, I've somehow attained a lot of new gear. Well, vintage gear that's new to me. In the living room, I replaced the restored NAD receiver with a restored, by me, Dynaco solid-state integrated amp. When it needed some more repair, I switched in a Nico TRM 750 integrated amp. Then a Pioneer SX780 receiver, and finally now, a Marantz 2252 receiver. In my home office system with my first turntable, I used a Sansui 2000A receiver for a while. But now, while I've still got the Marantz receiver in the living room, I've got 3 systems with DIY tube power amps. Yeah, for a while I was buying old stereo consoles, mostly Magnavox, removing the tube power amps, and rebuilding those. I built the first one as an integrated amp. 1 tube, a dual triode, and a volume control composed the built-in preamp. I built several single-ended tube amps, DG-SE1s, that are sensitive enough to use with built-in preamps in receivers and integrated amps. But then I built the Beaver Valley amp, which is really the Beavis Valley design by Morgan Jones. And that's where my search for separate preamps started. Sort of. I got a non-working Adcom tuner / preamp combo for free when I bought the matching power amp. And I got a Fisher Studio Standard control amplifier when I was assembling a system for a friend. We decided that he didn't need the Fisher, so I kept it. But why did the Morgan Jones power amp start me searching for preamps? Because that power amp needs 2 volts RMS input to reach full output power. I was just following Jones's design and didn't really understand the implications of that 2-volt sensitivity at the time. After building it and testing it and discovering its amazing sound quality, I tried it with some different preamps in my possession. Let's see, the Nico, NAD, and Fisher. I had tested the phono preamps in these and found them excellent. However, None of these could drive the Beaver Valley to full power. None of those preamps could deliver 2 volts from phono inputs. I looked through the specs of everything in my collection. The only one that could make 2 volts from phono inputs was the Adcom, which unfortunately remains resistant to my attempts to make it fully functional. Geez, I've got all these receivers and integrated amps, and all of their preamps have these anemic so-called line levels with phono inputs? What's up with that? I don't know for sure, but I can only figure that amplifying those tiny 2.5 millivolt phono input levels up to full-on 2-volt line levels is more expensive than stopping at 1.5 volts like the Marantz 2252 and NAD 701, or 1 volt like the Fisher CC3000 and Nico TRM 750, or half a volt like the Sansui 2000A and Pioneer SX828. If 2-volt preamp outputs are more expensive and less than 2 volts is cheaper, then what's up with the built-in power amps that have to take these anemic preamp outputs and still amplify them to full power? Are they saving money on preamps but making more expensive power amps? No, they're making inferior power amps. Wait, what? Yeah, this is a little weird. Stay with me now. Input sensitivity is largely a function of negative feedback. More negative feedback, less sensitive. Bigger input signal required for full power. Less negative feedback, more sensitive, smaller input signal required for full power. Dang, what is this negative feedback of which you speak? Must be bad, huh? If you don't know about negative feedback or it just sounds cruel, I'll explain briefly. When we feed a real signal into a real amp made of real components, we get a distorted signal out. How distorted depends on components, circuit design, what have you. Point is, the output isn't perfect, especially when the volume is cranked. What to do? We feed the output back to the negative side of the input to make that input anti-distorted so that the output is more nearly perfect. That negative feedback isn't free, though. We're sacrificing some of the amp's gain to get closer to perfection. The more we sacrifice, the closer to perfection we get, but sacrificing gain means we need a bigger input signal to reach full power. All else being equal, a low sensitivity amp, i.e. needing bigger input, is a more accurate amp. And by accurate, I don't mean what audiophiles mean by accurate sounding, because who knows what they mean really. I mean that the output is an objectively better, more nearly perfect reproduction of the input. But what's the hypothetical all else being equal thing? I'll give you an example. I built a sort of sequel to the Beaver Valley, which uses EL84 output tubes, with 6V6 output tubes instead. In some ways, 6V6s and EL84s are similar. They're capable of similar output power, and they can use the same output transformers. However, EL84s have higher gain. I didn't know that when I built my first draft of the so-called BV6V6. Yeah, I know. Dope. Anyway, I get it all put together with almost all the same component values and different output transformers. Same primary impedance as the ones on the Beaver Valley, just Harman Kardon instead of Dynaco. I was a little worried about those Harman Kardon output transformers. They're good, but the Dynacos are fabulous. The Beaver Valley can deliver nearly full power with little distortion all the way down to 20 Hertz. If you don't know, that's an amazing thing. What would the BV6V6 do? The first draft was awesome. Wow, what a relief. Amazing. Check out those 10 beautiful watts per channel. I checked the amplitude of the input. 3.5 volts RMS. Shit! That's rather much. Okay, crunch some numbers, reduce the amount of negative feedback. Oops, try again. One more time. Okay, 2 volts input for 10 watts output. But what about the bass? Not awful, but not great. Hey, the BV6V6 is a really nice power amp. The original Beaver Valley is just better. Okay, that was a lot to make this point. Receivers and integrated amps tend to skimp on the preamplification gain and use less negative feedback to make up the difference in the power amp. You have to dig deep into the specs to see what's going on. These cost-cutting measures are easy to hide in receivers and integrated amps. Am I saying separates are always better? Are separate preamps always better than built-in preamps? And are separate power amps always better than built-ins? No, that wasn't my point. But a good preamp ought to provide a proper 2-volt line level with phono inputs. Damn it! So I've been on the lookout for such preamps. I already had the ADCOM. I can't turn it off, and the tuner doesn't work right, but it's got an excellent phono stage and delivers a real line level. The only other one I've found is the Phase Linear 4000. Awesome preamp. Not perfect, but I can make it better. I have a plan in the works. Well, I said it's the only one I've found, but that's not really true. It's the only one I was willing and able to pay for. Look, I'm cheap as hell. Or maybe I'm just working my way up. Whatever, but good preamps are friggin' expensive. But why? Is making a 2-volt line level that expensive? No, good preamps do more than that. Like what? Like volume controls that are super precise and retain that precision? Like input selectors that eliminate crosstalk? I've got a back burner project to build a Morgan Jones practical tube preamp. The volume control will employ this ridiculous looking rotary switch, and there'll be discrete, precise resistors connecting all these tabs. Jones calls for mercury-wetted relays to connect the selected input and shunt the others to ground. Will I get there? We'll see. The point is that separate preamps can offer features rarely, if ever, found in built-in preamps. Like adjustable phono stage input impedance. Check out this feature on the Fisher CC3000. And the Phase Linear 4000 is packed with features. I haven't even figured them all out yet. But I like this dynamic unlimiter thing. What's it do? It boosts higher levels and reduces the lower ones. It's supposed to defeat or undo some of the compression introduced in the mastering, in particular the compression required for styli to track the grooves on vinyl. I don't think Bob Carver foresaw the compression on steroids of the loudness wars, but I generally do like the effect of this feature on the sound. Finally, a proper preamp is designed to drive both the power amp and a sufficient length of cable to keep preamp and power amp far enough apart that they don't interfere with one another. Really, I think the main concern is keeping the preamp isolated. Integrated amps and receivers can achieve some isolation by putting some components in cans or behind metal shields within the case. But distance, what with the R-squared law, works wonders. Longer cables generally have higher capacitance though, so preamp design needs to take that extra capacitance into account. In my dad's system, the preamp and power amp had some distance between them. The whole system, except speakers, was contained in an alcove about 3 feet wide and 4 or 5 feet deep. The turntable was on a shelf a little over waist height. The turntable itself was about 8 inches tall. The preamp and tuner were bulkhead mounted above the turntable, with the preamp at about eye height and the tuner, Macintosh, just above it. The power amp, Macintosh, was on a shelf behind the preamp and completely out of sight. I don't remember how or if the power amp was accessible without removing the bulkhead. The point is that the alcove was deep enough that there was some space between preamp and power amp. So what do? I set the power amp on top of the preamp. Hey, it's a work in progress. There's another reason to use separates, maybe the most important reason, especially if you're particularly fond of vintage tube power amps. A lot of people really like remote controls, but vintage tube amps don't have remote controls. But power amps don't need remote controls. The only control a power amp really needs is an on-off switch. If you've got to have a remote, you can get a preamp with a remote and use that preamp to feed whatever power amp, vintage or new, hollow or solid state, you want. So in the end, it comes down to flexibility. With separates, you can change only what you want to change and keep what you want to keep. And you can direct your investment, whether of time or money or both, where that investment can make the biggest difference. Plenty more could be said, but I'm going to end this video here. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. If you're a returning viewer, please subscribe to the channel. And please share your own experience. Are you a separates guy or gal? Or do you prefer integrated amps and receivers? Have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.